So there's not too much light reflecting on my glasses, no?
No, ma'am, it's okay.
Okay.
So now we are live on Facebook. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's session. I am Ishan Sharma, founder of Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. And today with me, I have a very special guest, Professor Jayas Tyagi from Delhi University. He's going to speak about interpreting anxiety, unraveling some preoccupations and concerns of ancient Indian tradition. Professor Tyagi is a legendary teacher in our Delhi University circle because we are from the university, and she is currently serving as professor at the Department of History there, Delhi University, and she is currently also the director of Women's Studies Development Center for Advanced Studies. She is also the chairman of ICC in Delhi University. Her research interests include ancient Indian history, gender and social history, household and society, religion, social context of rites and rituals, exploring early texts and traditions. He is the author of various books, articles, and edited volumes, including Contestation and Compliance, Retrieving Women's Agency from the Matsya Mahapurana, which was published by Oxford University Press in New Delhi in 2014, and Endangering the Early Household, Brahmanical Percepts in the Early Griha Sutra, middle of the first millennium BC, published by Oriental Longman Private Limited in Delhi in 2008. So without further ado, I would formally welcome and invite Professor Tyagi to deliver today's Caravan special lecture. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you, Ishan. It's a great pleasure to be here on the Carvan platform, and my compliments to the Carvan team for doing such a splendid job in this whole year. And congratulations to you. And I hope you have many such other events which really enhance your reputation too. Just one qualifying statement before I start. I was the chairman of ICC, so I'm no longer right now the chairman of ICC. So I'm going to be speaking on the study of history of emotions, which is complicated as emotions are experienced by individuals, but we can also talk of community emotions. Social scientists have only now begun to look at emotions' historical dimensions, so they tend to emphasize on emotions like happiness, sadness, bliss, eros, and desire, sometimes fear. Anxiety as an emotion has not really been talked about. Barbara Rosenwein, when speaking of emotions, emphasizes on the need to trace how they are experienced, expressed, and interpreted, as emotions are shaped by the societies in which they are embedded. They are culturally specific and subject to transformation or disappearance through time. And while emotions are embedded in the body and the brain, bodies and brains are shaped by culture. Thus, history of emotions must problematize the feelings of the past. In the course of dealing with diverse ancient traditions, I have been encountering different preoccupations and concerns, anxieties of compilers of the text, but it is in the context of the COVID situation that I realize what a powerful emotion anxiety is and how it can create its own dynamics in society. That community anxiety impacts different people in different manner, and that my anxiety has an impact on others. Questions emerge as how real or imagined anxiety is, how much it is whipped up to create a fear psychosis in order to control humans' behavior, and can we really talk about the creators, perpetuators of anxiety, the intentionality behind transmitting it and broadcasting it, how anxiety takes a shape of its own once it begins to be transmitted? The difficulty that a historian faces in dealing with ancient Indian sources is that not only one is looking at them through modern perspectives, but also that the traditions themselves would be expressing one perspective which may or may not reflect popular perception. The only way we can ascertain how traditions make an impact is to see whether they were emulated, practiced, talked about, cited, reiterated. This paper will look into specific anxieties of two varied traditions, epigraphic and textual. the former authorized by King Ashok and the latter compiled in the form of the Manav Dharma Shastra, also known as the Manu Smriti. Revisiting and rereading these texts by juxtaposing them together gives us an interesting insight into the concerns coming from two different spaces. One, a royal, regal space, the other, a Brahminic, ritualistic one, while both seek to present a discourse on their version of what construes as dharma or dhamma. In doing so, we will give a cursory glance at specific anxieties related to the interlinkage between society, state, religion, and women, taking examples from the Ashokan edicts and the Manava Dharma Shastra to compare the anxieties of these traditions and see what they reflect and the manner in which the anxieties were then replicated, reinvented, or carried forward. Anxiety is not really fear, but close to it. It implies insecurity, loss of control, and tells us a lot about the mindset of the authors and societies they lived in. An interpretation of the Ashokan edicts from the point of view of what Peter Stearns calls emotionology is interesting. William Reddy has talked about emotional regimes, which normally coincide with political regimes, and it seems Ashok, through choosing to communicate his preoccupations and concerns, is trying to create an emotional regime in which his directives about Dhamma will be creating and dominating the discourse on Dhamma. In doing so, he's refashioning the notion of kingship and styles of governance on his terms, but also attempting to regulate propriety, civic duties, and individual behavior. In the preoccupation with presenting Dhamma, foremost of his concerns are also related to his identity. The constant reference in the edicts to his name, Devanam Piyadasi, in the edicts, and the use of the first person by Ashok is unique and can be seen in the Rupanath Minor Rock Edict, in which he declares, I am openly a Buddhist. In the Major Rock Edict 6 at Girnar, he declares, this has been done by me as follows. This use of first person is rare in the Indian subcontinent and drawing attention to himself. This kind of individuation marks a shift in the notions of kingship in the subcontinent. Brahminical literary traditions hardly give us individual names, whether it is authors of the text or names of rulers and dynasties. This seems to have been a deliberate strategy, as it would give a notion of transcendent timelessness and underline the role of Brahminical advisors to validate every word of the king. Ashok makes no such distinction between the state and him. And although he does not say it explicitly, the king is then embodying the state. The fact that he does not mention his predecessors, his father or grandfather, or the Mauryan title at all, shows the focus of attention remains unwaveringly on him. Or is it that he did not want to be associated with them? It is also a fact that Ashok may have, overtly or covertly, fueled the debate on the relationship between Dharma and the ruler on one hand, and the Brahman advisors and the king on the other. So, what I'm saying is that Ashok may have fueled the debate on the relationship between the Dharma and the ruler on one hand, and Brahman advisors and king on the other, with the king emerging as someone who could initiate and control the debate on ethical propriety and behavioral attitudes. What had essentially been the purview of the Brahmins, but was being challenged, and even in the Upanishads, we find that the notion of the philosopher King Janak, you do have questioning of Brahminical dominance. In the Chandogya Upanishad, for example, Udalaka is instructed by King Pravahana Jayavali, and the reluctant king tells him that the information he's about to give him had never reached the Brahmins, which is why state power always belonged to royal classes. So the fact that the king is being invoked as instructing the Brahmin is intriguing, as one finds the reference seems to be to some knowledge which the Brahmins do not have, but the royal classes do. This indicates that the royal classes were being advised by different thinkers and philosophers, along with ritual Brahmins. And this need to advise the ruler is also again evoked in the Samanapal Sutra of Digha Nikaya, which refers to the six Samana thinkers. It mentions that the king Ajatashatru, despondent and on the advice of his minister Jivaka, goes to the forest to seek Buddha. And on Buddha's query as to whether he had sought advice from any others, the king recounts six different thinkers. That includes Makkali Gosal and others. So, how much of the passage is a historical fact and how much of it is a construct by compilers of the Digha Nikaya is difficult to say. The intention behind the inclusion of the episode is manifold. It shows the aspirations of Buddhist ideologues to be advisors of the king, that Buddha's philosophy appealed where others failed, and that kings were expected to seek spiritual solace, and that they would have anxieties related to the consequences of their actions, especially those which included killing of family members for power. However, the passage also has suspicious repetitions and seems to be a statement on king's lust for power and the need to channelize it through Buddha's teachings. So the king here is Ajatashatru, but then the kings become motives for other kings also. And what we find is that knowledge itself is subject to inquiry. While the Brahmins trained and specialized in Vedic rituals guarded their knowledge, this was constantly interrogated within Brahminical tradition itself by the Upanishads and also by different categories loosely termed as the Sramanas. So the king is seeking a discourse on Dhamma in the sutra of the Digha Nikaya. It seems to show that the king's interest in ethical discourse is sought to be facilitated. Now, this is true for Ashok too. Even after Ashok, even though Ashok is talking about, I am doing this is what I decree, Brahminical traditions would remove the individual persona and these time space discussions in keeping away with the notions of moving away from the aham, the self or the ego. And so ahankar, the need to do things only for the self, is looked down upon in Brahminical traditions. And in fact, this ahankar, pride, or self obsession is supposed to bring down the downfall of protagonists with negative characteristics in most Brahminical traditions, whether it's Ramayana or Mahabharata or even the Gita. And whether it's a subtle reference to Ashok or not so subtle reference, an anxiety is there amongst Brahminical ideologues against the appropriation of the role of the Brahman advisor till it is resurrected in Mudra Rakshasa hundreds of years later when the rise of the power of the Mauryans is attributed to Kautilya, the crafty Brahman. It is a tantalizing thought to surmise that there was no such figure and that it was a device to keep the Brahmins relevant as courtly advisors. Ashok's anxiety related to communicating and getting his word across seems to be a result of anxiety related to miscommunications or misinterpretations of the king's directives. The king was taking concrete measures to communicate with the populace and the administrators, be visible and influence the notions that the people had about the king, and also keep up a strong network of checks and balances so that the king's instructions were clearly spelt out and executed. It seems to show that the expectations of people relating to the king and the state were such that a need was felt to reach out. And one can envisage that the texts were not written merely for putting up on stone, but were being conveyed through reciters accompanied with drums and paraphernalia from village to village and town to town. The performative impact of these edicts would convey the king's message directly with minimum intermediaries. The fact that a need was felt for using written text, literally etched in stone for communicating and disseminating knowledge, is noteworthy. The writing itself shows an intention to define the state, also to create an archive that represents a particular perception of the king for posterity, and also create and reinvent the persona of the ruler by appealing to the emotional factor. Brian Stock, in his book, The Implications of Literacy, refers to how writing creates an emotional community. Is Ashok trying to forge an emotional community through his policy of Dhamma? The transition to literacy, the need to have concrete and visible forms of knowledge traditions etched in stone, accompanied with vigorous sharing of this knowledge, represents a departure in approach to knowledge dissemination. This has already been seen amongst the followers of Buddha, who were enjoined by Buddha to reach out, constantly be on the move, and communicate their ideology, if not with proselytizing zeal, but certainly with energetic fervor. This is in contrast to Brahminical exclusion and obscurity of the Vedic shakhas, specialist priests who allowed only brief exposure to their privileged knowledge to few persons in the controlled environment of rituals. The effort to guard knowledge as knowledge was power. Ashoka's edicts highlight an epistemological departure in the manner in which knowledge traditions were to be transmitted. Rather than keeping knowledge secret and obscure, they were meant to be dispersed, shared, transmitted through multiple mechanisms: oral, written, visual, performative, as well as on epigraphs and architectural remains. Ashoka's concerns relating to rituals as a mechanism for dispersal of resources and knowledge can be seen in his words related to rituals and violence, particularly his anxiety related to ritual violence. His first major rock edict launches the salvo against Brahminical rituals. As he says, here no living beings are to be killed for the purpose of sacrifice, nor there be made any public meetings or sacrifices. The earlier practice of participation of the king in rituals with the community would not suffice in this newly expanded state. Moreover, violence in rituals, however controlled and sanitized, would breed more violence and would be detrimental to administering the state. The edicts, of course, would launch their own rituals. They would evolve their own rituals. Choosing and zeroing on suitable sites at prominent places would involve incipient cartographical skills relating to understanding the terrain and routes of communications, some inherent local politics on which site is to be chosen, the choice of suitable persons for engraving the edicts, selection of readers who would read out the edicts publicly on particular festival days. The anxiety related to violence and killing of animals in rituals as well as in royal kitchen is extended towards killing in times of war. Ashok's preoccupation with nonviolence has to be seen in the light of the ever changing dynamics that existed in the time. Given the fluidity in dynastic power and the flexibility of territorial boundaries, it is not difficult to understand why and how ideologies related to combating violence would evolve. Once the king had gained power through violence, he could afford to espouse the cause of nonviolence, entreating his subjects that they espouse nonviolence too. It would help in controlling the populace and the territories. Nonviolence was a convenient device, preventing others from challenging the king's authority. The edicts which refer to the Kalinga War mention that 100,000 were killed and 150,000 deported, and many died from other causes. And even if the numbers are exaggerated, and this could well be so, as Kalinga itself does not have these edicts, it raises many questions. The king states that he felt inclined towards Dhamma after Kalinga had been conquered. He feels deep remorse for the conquest, and he clearly states that. The pain is for the suffering that he caused to Brahmins, Shramans, householders of different religions who were injured, killed, or separated from their loved ones. And he states that even those who are not affected suffer when they see friends, acquaintances, companions, and relatives affected. He concludes that conquest by Dhamma is the best conquest and states that this Dhamma conquest has been done all over in the place where the edict was, on borders 600 yojans away where the Greek king Antiochus rules, beyond which there are four kings, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas, and Alexander. Likewise, in the south, amongst the Cholas, Pandyas, and the Tamraparni, the Dhamma has spread, and in the king's domains, the king states, the Greeks, Kambojas, Nabakas, Nabapankits, the Bhojs, the Pitinikas, the Andhras, and the Palidas, everywhere they follow Dhamma. Now, the concerns relating to the violence unleashed on the populace of Kalinga is intriguing, as Kalinga itself does not have these edicts. Why? Was it too raw an emotion to inflict on the populace? Or is it that after having carried out this devastation, the king is using Kalinga as an example in other regions as a warning? Moreover, who were the people who were deported and where were they taken? Was it Sanati, the other place where the Kalinga edicts do not figure? In that case, the Kalinga reference does not figure. In that case, was there a cultural purge being carried out, the memory of which is now erased by the king himself, who reinvented himself through his edicts and became the non-violent pacifist, according to some, for posterity? If there was a purge, was this against Buddhists or Shamanas or Brahman Shamanas or who? These questions remain in the realm of uncertainty and really have not been followed up. There is also anxiety related to sectarian conflicts in his edicts. In the fourth edict, Devanam Piyadasi expresses concern how in the past many hundred years, killing, harming of living beings, improper behavior towards relatives and Brahmins and Shramans has increased. The seventh edict refers to the fact that he desires that all sects should reside everywhere, as all promote self-control and purity of heart. However, he seems to warn against those who receive great gifts and yet are lacking in self-control, purity of heart, gratitude, and firm devotion. This has been taken to be a potshot at Brahmins, but along with Brahmins, he could be warning against schisms and conflicts and corruption within the Shamanas too, as we see in his minor edicts that he was concerned about schisms within the Sangha of the Shakyaputra Samanas, the Buddhists, and whether it's the Bharat edict or the other edicts, he refers to that. There is some difference in the minor, major, and pillar edicts, as otherwise there would not have been a need to have these different categories of edicts. Ashok himself mentions that different edicts have been put in different places depending on the particular requirement of that place. The minor edicts associations with Buddhist sacred spaces, as pointed out by Himanshu Prabhare and others, is too coincidental to be ignored. But whether it was due to Ashok promoting the sect or the fact that he was using areas where Buddhism had already gained entry to further his own personal endorsement of his version of Dhamma and gain legitimacy through Buddhists is debatable. The fact that they probably reinforce each other. A rich epigraphical archive commissioned by Ashok gives us evidence, or rather this rich epigraphical archive gives us evidence relating to the existence of the state and its attempt to intervene in different area of subject's life. His edicts mark the first time we get inscriptions from the subcontinent and lead us into the psyche of Ashok, his notion of kingship and his anxieties. The pattern of layout of the edicts follows the polycentric pattern of networks crisscrossing the entire length and breadth of the subcontinent, except some areas, and reveal how Ashok rode on the crest of the interconnections that were laid out prior to him, but were also facilitated and reinforced by him. The interconnectedness indicates the emergence and crystallization of the spatial entity, which was separate and distinct from other regions and known as Jambudvipa. This growing identity of distinctiveness, which is underlined in the edict, would have emerged with the growing interactions with the Persians and then the Greeks, encounters with them who regarded this whole region east of the Indus as distinct, would mean growing realization of their own identity. We have seen how Ashok underlines the identification of the state with the persona of the ruler and how he seeks to map the areas over which he governs. The significance of understanding this is that instead of visualizing the spread of state system by the Mauryans in the Deccan region, we actually can envisage Ashoka's inroads into an already expanding network of monks, traders, and pilgrims. Ashok's attempt to facilitate travel and communication networks through administrators and soldiers in areas through routes which were already being traversed and opened up. Thus, Ashok's edicts represent not a uniform control over entire regions wherever they have been found, but represent an attempt to cartographically mark those areas that had some significance. This is where the idea of nodes and corridors becomes significant as Ashok places the minor edicts in areas which already must have had Buddhist influence and all the major edicts in areas where he wants to influence the narrative on Dhamma. One of the important aspects of Ashoka's edicts is the constant reference to Brahman Shamanas. The significant detail here also seems to be how he places the Brahman and Shraman categories together, thus in one stroke elevating the status of the Shramanas to the category of the Brahman. This idea of the ruler may have rankled the Brahmins, but was in keeping with the shift in ideological thinking that we have been talking about. And we find that the compound Samana Brahman is used as an antagonistic compound, and Patanjali's Mahabhashya refers to Shramana Brahman as those who are in eternal conflict. So 100 years after Ashok also, when Patanjali is writing about Shaman Brahmanas, it is as opposing sort of opponents. So while Shraman Brahman conflict is a recurring anxiety, we also find that Ashok takes a stand related to women's involvement in ceremonies. And he warns women against senseless and wasteful expenditure. And according to him, proper conduct is more important than carrying out ceremonies, wasteful ceremonies. In the 9th edict, Ashok cautions against various ceremonies performed during sickness, marriage of sons and daughters, birth of children, ceremonies before going on a journey, and other occasions. These seem to be rites and rituals which are mentioned in Brahminical texts, like some of them, like the Greh Sutras, which I have worked on. So the fact that he mentions that women in particular perform many vulgar and worthless ceremonies which don't bear fruit is significant, I think. And it is, Ashoka says, it's Dhamma which bears fruit, proper behavior towards servants and employees, respect for teachers, restraint towards living beings, and generosity towards Shramana and Brahmanas is required. Now, the fact that he is saying that other ceremonies do not give fruit and they may achieve some purpose, but only in this world, and this Dhamma is timeless and it's only that which will lead you to gain merit in the next world, also shows the notions of life and afterlife and how Dhamma is a resource which accrues and will serve you after life too. In the Allahabad Kosambi Queen's Edict, we have a peep in the kind of donation the Queen makes. The edict is the only one which gives us personal details of Ashok's life, that he was married, that the Queen's made donations, that the second Queen, Karuvaki, the mother of Tiwala, very specifically asked that gifts be registered in her own name. And this would imply that she was making it clear that her gifts should be linked to her identity. And whether this was done to distinguish herself from other members of the family or why is not clear. It tells us about the kind of grants that the Queen made, mango groves, gardens, houses where the poor could be given alms, and also that the Mahamatras were actively involved in executing these grants. Now, one place of commonality which we find in the Ashoka's concern about women's rituals and the Dharma Shastra's concern is in women conducting rituals. And if you turn to the Manava Dharma Shastra, we find that it shows anxiety related, I mean, besides all the other anxieties, it shows anxiety related to women carrying out religious observances independently and categorically denies it. So, both whether it's Manu or Vishnu, they state in their smritis, state that there is no separate sacrifice, vrat or fast, upvas for a woman, and she attains heaven if she serves her husband. So they're talking about the Pati Vrata woman. The Vishnu Dharma Shastra 25.16 goes so far as to state that if a woman conducts a vrat with a fast while her husband is alive, she deprives her husband of life and goes to hell. So further, the Dharma Shastras also state, and this is Vishnu Dharma Shastra and Angiras, that if she conducts any act without the consent of her father, husband, or son, then the act yields no fruit for her. Now, this anxiety is continued in Manusmriti, which says that no rite is performed by women or for women with the recitation of mantras, the ritual formulae. That is the well established law according to Manu. And he says women without strength, they don't have strength, they don't have mantras, so they are the untruth. And that is the fixed rule. The Manusmriti also seeks to control women from joining other sects by denying libations to them when they have died. So, after death, there were certain ceremonies to be performed. And Manu gives a list of people who should not be given these ceremonies because they are socially ostracized. And this tells us a little about the anxiety of Manu with relation to specific categories. Libations are omitted in the case of people born through caste mingling. Vratha Sankara Jatana, those who live in ascetic orders, Pravarayasu, self-annihilation, Atmanasya Tyagina, women who have joined heretical sects, Pashandam Shritanam, women who roam at will, Charantinam, who harm their fetus or drink liquor. Now, what do these statements tell us about Manu's anxieties vis-a-vis women? Were they passive and inert who were quietly following the norms prescribed in these texts? Aren't these texts prescriptive rather than descriptive? Are they not more about anxieties of Manu and other authors with regard to the role of women in establishing social order? The anxiety with which this issue is addressed seems to relate to the social implications of women carrying out observances and joining heretical sects. It would affect social relations, patronage, the popularity and dissemination of certain cults over others. It also seems as if women were actively carrying out these activities. Otherwise, what would be the need to prohibit them? And Manu's anxiety seems to suggest that more and more people women were joining different sects and asserting their right to conduct vrats and religious observances in different ways. And so, in that sense, this seems to be hinting at some degree of agency, though limited, that women were exercising, possibly forcing their inclusion, taking the adhikar to perform ritual observances into their own hands, and also moving towards other cults for spiritual engagement. Now, another area where Manu shows anxiety is that related to marriage and the role of the wife. In the Manu Smriti, it very clearly says why wives should be kept happy. And he says that providing honor to women relatives is important. If one desires abundance of good fortune, women should be revered. And then he goes on to say, where women are revered, there the gods rejoice. Yatra naryastu pujyante ramante tatra devata. Yatra astu na pujyante sarvaste tatra falah kriya, afalah kriya. That means what if they are not uh, worshipped, there no right will bear fruit. And soon after, although this is a very often quoted sentence to show that Manu says women should be worshipped, but he goes on to say why. And that is because he says that he implies that women have negative energy. He says where women relatives grieve, the family soon comes to ruin, but where they do not grieve, it always prospers. When women relatives are not given reverence, and if they curse the house, it comes to total ruin, as if struck down by witches. And if men want to become prosperous, they should always honor the women on joyful occasions, festive days with gifts, adornments, clothes, and food. So, this anxiety about the wife as being someone, or the women of the household as someone who can bring in negative energy, is seen also in the references to the incoming bride. And we find that Manusmriti 3.45 says that a man should marry a girl belonging to the same varna and possessing the right body characteristics, with ancestry different from his father's and from his mother's, and unrelated to him by marriage. Now, it's not that Manu is the first one to talk about this anxiety related to the incoming bride. I have worked on the Grey Sutras, which are actually very concise texts and written in a very terse style, but which spend considerable time on how the bride is to be selected. And the Grey Sutras refer to the fact that which girls are to be avoided while fixing marriages. These include, and the terms used are rather strong, girls who would be Prajaghani, the destroyer of children, Pashughani, a destroyer of animals, Patighani, a destroyer of the husband, and Devarghani, a destroyer of the husband's brother. So you can imagine the pressure or the anxiety of the incoming bride when she comes in and has to bear the honors of any misfortune which may just fall on that family. So this equation of women with negative energy, and then Manu is just going way ahead uh, in from the Grey Sutras, when in 3.67 Manu says the type of families to be avoided even though they may be rich and prominent. And this includes families which neglect rights, are deficient in male issue, who don't have male children, do not have Vedic learning. And also, he talks about illnesses like tuberculosis, epilepsy, leukoderma, leprosy, etc. So, very clear othering and social distinction is being made by Manu on the basis of health, physical fitness, ability to have male children, and also aspects like Vedic learning. And that is why, and this goes on, because, and it shows the anxiety of Manu, because he's saying that a wise man should not marry a woman who uh, who has no brother or whose father is unknown, as this would create inheritance issues. Then Manusmriti 3.8 to 10 makes a rather large list of what is to be avoided in a girl. And this includes a girl who has red colored hair or an extra limb, so anything that's out of ordinary, who is sickly looking, who has too much or too little body hair, who speaks too much or is sickly yellow looking, who is named after a constellation, tree, or river, or other names which, create homology, so she will behave like her name. And then it states that who he should marry, and he should marry a woman who's not deficient in any limb, who has a pleasant name, who walks like a swan or an elephant, who has fine body and head hair, small teeth and delicate limbs, etc., etc. So this anxiety related to marriage, who to marry and who not to marry, is extended also to how the bride should be from the same Varna. And Varna consciousness and taboos related to maintenance of Varna hierarchies gradually seem to ossify over time. And it seems as if, because of endogamous practices, connubial taboos would have predated commensal taboos. And we also find that Manu is going a step ahead when he talks about marriage, and especially if the Savarna marriage is the best. And if Savarna marriage doesn't take place, then if the boy is of a higher Varna and the girl of a lower Varna, then it's Anulom marriage. Now, Dharma Shastras before Manu gave the children of such marriages the same status as the father. But Manu says that they fall in rank because of, and the word he uses, Matri Dosh, because of um, the negative qualities in the mother from being a lower Varna. So while Anulom is still in some ways thought about, Pratilom, the reverse, where the woman is of a higher caste and the man of a lower caste, is totally taboo, and the worst kind the when such marriages happen, then the offspring is punished by seeing a fall in their status, and therefore he says it is Pratilom marriages, and the worst marriage would be a Brahmin woman with a Shudra girl, and that leads to the emergence of the Chandals. So, chapter 10 of the Manusmriti refers to this contamination of the Varnas, Varna Sankara, and he gives whole lists of mixed classes, mixed castes which have emerged from the Varna Sankara. And from that, very clearly we can see, I mean, it would, the number of the list that he is giving would seem to show that there are too many such marriages happening. But actually, what is happening is Manu is is cataloging the lists of the lower categories during his time, and then tracing their origins to some kind of an origins where the parents transgressed, and that is why the children have this kind of a status in present time. So he also goes to say that it is, if you neglect the rights, if you don't maintain Varna marriages, then there is fall in status, and that is why. And he also says how you can identify such categories is by the work they do. So he is actually laying down the conditions for Varna stratification, marriage, and occupations. And there is also this anxiety related to different kinds of works which Manu is talking about. So he says that amongst the lower categories, the kind of activities they do, the Sutas manage horses and chariots, the Ambashtas do healing. The Vedikas take care of women. The Magadhas do trading activities. The Nishads fishing. The Ayogavas carpentry. The Medas, Andhras, Kunkus, and Madhus hunt wild animals. Others are involved in trapping and killing animals like the Kshatras, Ugras, and the Pulkasas, while the Digavanas work in leather. The Venas play drums. And then he also shows how these people live in segregated parts of in segregated areas and near cemeteries, hills, and groves, and they are recognizable by occupations specific to them. He also says that they have restricted resources and they have to perform the task at the command of the king, wear distinguishing marks, etc., etc. So Manu has many such anxieties. There's anxiety related to paternity. There's anxiety related to Stri Swabha, which has been talked about in by different scholars. Uma Chakravarti talks about it. So it's not as if there is. I mean, this I can do a comprehensive analysis of all the anxieties that Manu had. But if I try to conclude by giving some points related to what these two kinds of traditions mean and what they imply, whether it's the Ashokan edicts or the Manav Dharma Shastra, I can just see some uh, aspects emerging out of this. One is that there is a competition or a tussle going on for who would determine what is dharma. And while Ashok is talking about Dhamma in his edicts, there are also a series of Dharma Shastras coming out, one after the other, reiterating the notions of Brahminical Varna system. And that is one area where we find a distinction because Ashok doesn't mention the Varna system at all, except that he's talking about the Brahman, Shraman categories. And then he is placing them as equal categories, actually. There is a clear othering in Manu, where he's obsessed with Varna, he's obsessed with Varna Sankara. Marriage is critical for maintaining the social order of Varna, for controlling women. He also is talking about how women should not join the Pashanda sects. Otherwise, there's total silence about other sects. But from this, you can see that those sects are making inroads into household systems. He also has an opinion on the types of work, on connubial and commensal taboos, on purity, pollution, how a king should behave, etc., etc. Ashok is concerned with violence, with rituals, with Brahman Shraman conflict, with ethical propriety, aspects like the need to give respect to parents, elders, etc., which Manu also mentions. But he is also concerned about facilitating interconnections within the regions, of defining the region which he is supposed to administer. He is concerned with maintenance of administrative checks and balances. He is totally reinventing or carrying forward the reinvented knowledge traditions, how you need to communicate and reach out. Brahminical silence on Ashok is very significant. They rarely quote him, but you can see the silences also are very are interesting. It is the Buddhist tradition which keeps Ashoka's memory alive in different ways, but those are ways that suit the monastic orders relating to patronage. So, the whole notion of he built 84,000 stupas, etc., etc., etc. Ashok himself doesn't mention that. Ashok never, he mentions all these Greek rulers and etc. He never mentions Sri Lanka. If he had sent an embassy there, then why not? If he's mentioning other places, so on one hand, we find that there are significant silences related to Ashok in Brahminical traditions, but in Buddhist traditions, his memory is kept alive. Manu, of course, is reiterated again and again. The Dharma writers refer to him, the medieval commentaries mention Manu, the Britishers, the colonial times also. And so it seems as if Manu's anxieties get internalized by societies which live on this hierarchical basis, and particularly his anxieties with respect to women and how their control was integral for the maintenance of social order is something which is reiterated and reinvented and exerted in different ways. Of course, this is also done through cherry picking because, on one hand, Manu's misogyny is accepted, but not his notions related to worshipping women. Or even, like Manu himself says that Bhrun Hatya is the worst possible. It's like Brahman Hatya. But you have so much female feticide in modern India. So, how you interpret Manu or accept it also is in a way convenient. So I would conclude by saying that the exploration of anxiety is important as it leads us into the insecurities, worries, and apprehensions of loss of control, while also reflecting problems that are perceived by ideologues. Anxiety is not only enculturated, but also class and gender differentiated, as while some categories deal with basic anxieties such as food and sustenance or even survival, others deal with other anxieties, health, disease, wealth, power, control over others. And in that sense, anxiety mirrors social reality, or at least perceived social reality. And when mentioned in normative traditions, it indicates an attempt to express, broadcast, and transmit this anxiety. And this transmission itself has a social dimension. It allows for leverage and control over others. Expression of anxiety, then, when it becomes included in coded traditions, shows intentionality. It's calling social attention to that anxiety. So it does not remain a personal emotion, but can be pitched as a community shared agenda. Whether it represents the community entirely is itself subject to debate. So I'll stop here for today. And I don't know.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for delivering today's session. It was truly an honor to have you, and we have some questions for you. And I'll read
Okay.
questions. And
I'm
the
just trying to see you. I can't see you, so I'll just sort of. Yes, now I can.
yeah. So
Just
this
one
question,
minute. I'll switch on the light and then
madam.
I'll take the questions.
Those who are
Yes.
right now, please do subscribe to Carvan if you are watching us on YouTube. Don't forget to do that. So moving ahead with the Q&A. The first question is from Sukhdev Sohal ji. He's watching us from Amritsar. His question is, did the Brahmins show anxiety on account of Ashoka's indifference to Brahmins or his turn towards people? Please differentiate anxiety from emotionality. Was Ashok too having anxiety or he was having emotionality?
Well, there's when you say that is he being emotional or is he being anxious, it is really open to interpretation. And while others can say, well, he's, just sort of listing out his administrative priorities, I have deliberately chosen only those areas where I felt that there is some level of anxiety creeping in. And yes, the difference between being emotional and being anxious is not that clearly defined. They're part of a spectrum. And, as I started itself by saying that, there is fear, there's anxiety, there's emotion, being emotional. There is also, it could be just administrative efficiency. But as a historian and somebody who likes to see these things around my society as well as in textual traditions, I feel that there is a degree of anxiety in the edicts which is seeping through. Even though the edicts are, not coming, although there is reference to first person, obviously there are somebody would have written it out, whether Ashok did it himself or dictated it, and then it's being etched in stone. And then so it's not as if, there is, I mean, as if I'm communicating with you in that sense. But it is a form of communication and it does come across as emotion, which is in my view anxiety. But you can say it, you can say it's something else also. I mean, this
Uh,
is interpretive, of course.
yeah. Uh,
The
the
other
next
question on the Brahmins, whether they are referring to Ashok, very little. The Puranic Vanshavalis refer to Ashok in a very oblique manner, that too. But there is really a remarkable silence, which is all the more remarkable because the tradition of Ashok, has its own life. And the way it percolates all over, you get versions of Ashok in China, you get it in Tibet, you get it in Sri Lanka, but it's in a sense not that obvious in the subcontinent, and that is very that silence is remarkable, and that shows he made an impact. For me, when you ignore something or you don't refer to it, that itself is very revealing. So and then you are yourself changing the entire way in which you're perceiving things. So, the fact that one after the other dharma shastras are, coming out, that need to say that we are the custodians of dharma and we are going to say what dharma essentially is, seems to be a backlash not only of Ashok but other events and other aspects that were happening. So PV Carney actually is very, if you read PV Carney, is very remorseful in the sense he says that the Brahmins did nothing while the Shaks came and the Kushans came and the Hunas came, and the Brahmins actually did nothing. Actually, they were really active. That is the period in which Puranic literature is coming up. The Itihas Puran tradition is a reworking of Brahminical traditions in an inclusive manner. So while the Dharma Shastras were exclusive and still, pandered to being for the Brahmins and then, looking for very small degree of percolation, the Itihas Puran tradition is very inclusive, even while keeping the parameters of social stratification very much there, so they are perpetuating Varna Ashram Dharma too in their own way. Yes, so
The next question is from Harshavardhan Alluri, and his question is: Manu's anxiety regarding women's religious rights and rituals clearly shows that he is trying to impose patriarchy. Does this imply that there was considerable freedom for women in the earlier period? Can you throw some light on that?
see, I'm not saying there was freedom for women ever. One characteristic of patriarchy is that it is universal, and it has been there from very, from almost from the time when the state and society emerged. And if you read Gerda Lerner, she says gender predates class. Claude Melassu, Gerda Lerner, they are the ones who say that patriarchy and control over reproduction and sexuality predates private property and other social differentiation. So, in that sense, you can't say that women have been free in any sense. The relationship between women and religion is very complicated. religious structures are inherently patriarchal and male centric. But women still turn to religion and religious observances because of various factors. They are part of society, they internalize the notions of what religion means or how, and it is in religious benefaction that elite women get some degree of control over resources, and that is also, I think, confined only to elite women, and that is why you have the queens making these copious donations. But what are they donating for? They're donating for the betterment of their family. And if you read the works on inscriptions relating to donations, it shows that women are identifying themselves mainly with their families. It could be the husband, it could be the father, or in some cases they are the bhikkhunis also with the sangha. So, in that sense, women are not acting independently, but they do have some degree of control over resources in religious spaces, and that is one reason why they turn to religion. Another reason why elite women look for benefactions, etc., is because they're competing amongst themselves. In polygynous societies where the one rich man has many wives, the wives are not competing with the men. Patriarchal societies, women don't compete with men, they compete amongst themselves. They compete for resources, they compete for male attention, they compete for whatever they are able to garner in the household for their children. So, in that sense, if you see the donations and religious activity, it doesn't mean women are more free. It means they are very constrained in their familial systems. And within the constraints, they negotiate constantly with patriarchy for more resources, for more decision making, for better terms. Yes.
The next question, when we are talking about Manu now, it's time to talk about Ashok. This question is from Arjun Abhishek Roy, and his question is, he has two questions. The first question is, did Ashok bring any change or reform from the age-old puritanical Brahmanical tradition? The religious and ritualistic duty and imposition were always bestowed upon the women. One chief reason is to keep them at home and prevent them from occupying space at the world outside. Did any change happen during Ashok's time due to Buddhism?
Uh, that's interesting. The question is very interesting because the sources we get for women in Buddhism are at least 200-300 years after Buddha. So and during the time of Ashok, these texts are still being canonized. We get that from his Bharat inscription. We know that he is also, participating in the process of canonization because he says these are the discourses which should be followed. Now, the fact that the king is listing out the discourses which should be followed shows his intervention in the Sangha. And in that sense, he is talking about bhikkhus and bhikkhunis both. What role women had in the propagation of Buddhism is also very interesting because it's something which has not really been studied that much. Uh, and it has a lot of potential because we do know that the bhikkhunis' participation is something which is very important. And if you see the uh, articles, for example, Kumkum Roy's article or other people who have worked on the Sanchi inscriptions, and they show 50%, around 50%, 48% of the donations were by women. And amongst them, there are more bhikkhunis than bhikkhus. So the role of devoted bhikkhunis in propagation of Buddhism is only acknowledged much later in a commentary by Dhammapal. So whether it was done in Ashoka's time, we really don't know. Ashok, of course, refers to bhikkhus and bhikkhunis of the Sangha when he says that there should not be Sangha Vibhedana, that there should not be a schism. And so in that sense, he's mentioning both. So we do know that bhikkhunis were there. But again, coming to the question of patriarchy, because that's a favorite subject of mine, um, if you see the Sangha and if you see the role of the bhikkhunis, there is the Garudhamma, and which the rules that the bhikkhunis have to follow. And out of the 8 rules, the first rule says that even if there's been somebody has been a bhikkhuni for 100 years, she is below in stature to a bhikkhu who's been there for one day. So actually, the Sangha is not such a, a sort of a gender equitable space. It also has its own version of patriarchy, and we have to acknowledge that.
The next question is from Sukhdevji again, and his question is: do you suggest that self, even among women, was emerging out of an individual within a family or a group? What were the material conditions in which Manu theorized to condition, contain, and control self of a woman, causing anxiety?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Do you suggest that self, even among women, was emerging out of an individual within a family or a group?
Self. Okay, so I'm not quite sure if I understand what that means. Is he talking about the aham, the ego?
Yeah, I think he's talking about the aham part that you mentioned in your lecture.
Okay, so in terms I um, really we don't have any evidence of that for where are the women's voices coming from? We get that one queen's edict, that's it. That also is not her edict, it is mentioning her. It is a directive by the king given to the Mahamatras. So it's not her voice at all. So where are we getting the women's voices? We get male voices which are presenting women's voices. And so we really don't know about, whether the self is emerging. So even if you see Mahabharat, you'll say Kunti said this, Gandhari said this, Draupadi said this. They are not saying all this. It is the author of the text who is using them as protagonists for saying all that. So, where we are not getting actual voices of women, but the fact is that there must be some informal traditions because there is anxiety about them. If Ashok is saying that women should not perform ceremonies which are wasteful and which do not bring any, fruit in this world, that means that they were doing these ceremonies. So, in that sense, we do find that women, it's only from an oblique way that we do get to know about women's participation, their individuality, their individuation. Otherwise, we don't really have sources, unless you are talking about the Theri Gatha. But the Theri Gatha also, again, follows a typical norm of how the bhikkhunis are talking about themselves and the Sangha. But that is one evidence which we get where we get women's voices. Otherwise, we don't.
So we'll take one last question for the day, and this question is from Vicky Patel, and her question is: was there any institution which opposed Manu, which was contemporary to Manu?
Manu's date itself is very contentious. And Patrick Olivelle has talked about how the Manav Dharma Shastra is a concise text and it has a very organized framework, etc. Otherwise, prior to that, Manu, there were some scholars who felt it's not one person's work, it is a school of scholars, etc., etc. So Manu himself, but the fact that you're using a term like Manu, which goes back to the Vedic times, and then, it's a very common term. So we really don't know who this Manu was. So to know that whether in contemporary times he had any debates and discussions, we don't know. But the Manav Dharma Shastra itself incorporates references to prior persons who have talked about these issues. So from that, you can understand that he is bringing in uh, the debates related to discourses, and there would have been debates in that context. All right, but besides that, we do know that after him there's a lot of references to him, and from the time of Yajnavalkya and others also keep reiterating Manu and saying that he has spoken the last word. But contemporary to him, it's very difficult to say.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time to deliver this lecture. And we were trying to get you for a very long time, and finally, this was the
No,
day.
I know. Finally, it happened. So that's nice. Thank you, Ishan, and thank you, everybody, for joining in. And it's been a pleasure. And this is a work in progress, actually. So it'll be good if I get feedback, or, so that's why I'm putting it out in the open. So I'm working on a book right now, which has some aspects of this. Of course, not related to anxiety, but this was something which I wanted to talk about. So I'm glad that you gave me this platform, and thank you very much.
And we look forward to that book. And if our participants have any feedbacks, please share it at carvanheritage@gmail.com. We'll share those feedbacks with Professor Tyagi through her email.
Thank
So
you.
thank you
Thank you
so
so
much, ma'am,
much.
and thank you so much everybody who joined us live. The video will be available on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe live and like and share the
All
video.
right.
Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.